Welcome, Grace. It's great to have you here today for this interview. I was fascinated by the post that you did on LinkedIn, which made me reach out and invite you here for a chat to talk about the work that you do and how you see the world and how you use that in the workplace. So I suppose you could categorize our conversation today as part of Industry 4.0 and the future of work. So if you'd like to give a wee bit of an introduction to yourself, tell us who you are and what it is you do.
Sure. So thanks, Colin, for inviting me to having this chat. I'm always interested in just connecting to people in different places who are also interested in looking at patterns, helping people collaborate more, and delivering a better impact while ensuring all the pieces are engaged. So that's something I'm very passionate in. And my background is actually in psychology. I am a registered psychologist based in Hong Kong. I work a lot in Asia Pacific, but also sometimes elsewhere, for example, in Europe. The company I'm working for is called Atrain. It's a consultancy headquartered in Germany. And we do quite a lot of work with leadership development as well as organizational development. Actually, maybe I can share a bit about how I started my career, because that's also has something to do with why I am now focusing so much on patterns and systems. So I started my career a decade ago with executive assessment. So that's also a lot of the starting point for organizational psychologists. So we started with looking at individual leaders, doing role plays with them, also observing them in group discussions and see how they perform. And I used to spend lots of time creating leadership profiles for these people. So telling them that, okay, you're good at this and you have to develop in certain areas. Those were all, helpful, and people do, say that they get good insights from this. But what bothers me is that the actual impact of these leaders have very little to do with their individual profiles. They might be a bright star with brilliant strengths, but if they are not in a context with a team or with a culture, a system that actually enables them to show all their strengths, then it doesn't really do much. So that's actually what prompts me into looking at systems and teams and patterns of collaboration. Because for me, it's almost the analogy of comparing a star performers or even a group of star performers versus a star team. Yeah. And my money will always be on the star team, because it's just that the star team delivers. Yeah. So that's how I started.
And so can you tell me a wee bit about that transition? Because it sounds like you went through a wee bit of an epiphany in terms of shifting your focus. So can you talk us through that process of the shift and how you identified that teams were more powerful than or star teams are more powerful than star individuals?
Yeah. So I guess that's the thing, because I also used to run quite a lot of leadership development programs. And what you realize is that sometimes people can, let's say if it's a coaching program, okay, so I help leaders to learn coaching skills. And they could coach quite well in the workshop. You could even ask them to videotape a session for you, and they could coach quite well, really using the tools and all. But then if you do a follow-up with them later on, and then you ask them what actually happened, you would get things like, I really had no time to do coaching at all. Or maybe some people, they had the intention to coach, but then when they are with the employee, they can only think of all the pressure that's coming in about achieving targets, trying to deal with interdepartmental conflict, trying to sort things out rather than actually developing the individual and empowering the individual. And then start seeing, okay, there's a disconnection. There's a disconnection between individual learning the skills and capability and the application of it. And the application of whatever skills and competency someone has acquired depends on the context. If the context does not enable, they don't actually do it.
Yeah.
And that's also the point where some of our clients are talking to me and say, oh, you know what, Grace, I think we need more than skill building. We need mindset change. And then when they talk about mindset change, eventually they realize it's not just mindset change, it's a cultural change we're talking about. And to actually make that cultural change happen, we may need some degree of structural change. We may need to revisit our process. We need to think about what really are the must-do and what are the things that are optional or things we need to get rid of in order to enable people to be at their best, unleashing potential. So that's when I really feel that there's something other than the individuals that we need to look at. And actually, on this note, there's one example I want to share with you.
Yeah.
So Atrain in our Hong Kong office, we are doing 4-day work week. So, right. Which is a relatively new practice, I think, in the market. And people always ask me, okay, well, how can you do this? Like, how can you manage to get the same amount of work done with less time? Because in the end, that's about efficiency, right, and effectiveness.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I said, well, look at your diary and think about, how much time you have actually spent on things that are not necessary. Some long, useless meetings that could have been done with an email. And if you go a layer deeper and ask yourself, then why are organizations having all these meetings and process that most people don't find useful, and still, keep doing that for decades? Yep. You realize what some teams and organizations are trying to create with those unnecessary meetings were this illusion of collaboration.
Wow, illusion of collaboration.
So they're trying to convince themselves that if we are sitting together all the time, seeing each other in the office, that means we are collaborating. Uh-huh. But the question is that true? Because in my line of work, I feel that sometimes I'm hired, particularly to just point out that it was an illusion. Because once you talk to the people, once you even do a network analysis with them, you will realize that maybe on the surface, 2 teams are working well, but then in reality, it could just be a one-way communication from one team to the other. Maybe the first team feel that they are communicating a lot and helping the other team, while the other team actually thought that the first team was interfering and was actually not adding value. So what ends up is that you have, on the surface, they are working together, but in reality, you have a stressed team, and then also a team that's very frustrated. Yep. And these patterns, and all the patterns and the stories people create about these patterns, both for me are important to be put on the table, because for me that's the blockage to real work. And if we take away this blockage, I guarantee you, people can work to deliver as much with a lot less time.
That's absolutely fascinating, because it's those blockages and identifying those blockages and then identifying actions as to how to overcome them, which are the essence, I think, of what you're talking about. So I would like to delve a wee bit deeper into the process of how you identify what looks like collaboration and what is collaboration. So how do you do that? And then maybe we can go back at a later stage and look a wee bit more about your 4-day week and how you came to implement that, because I think there's quite a lot of conversation about 4-day weeks, but I don't think there's a lot of understanding about what the reality of that is. So if we can begin looking at how you go about looking at these patterns and identifying the change that can take place, and then we can go back.
Mm-hmm. So on identifying patterns, there's also some, for me, it's a personal transformation as well, because my training was with focus, in the beginning of my career, is more focusing on the individual. Mm-hmm. So I looked, in the beginning, it was more around looking at the patterns of an individual. So I see if someone always does something, but then later on, I went through a very experiential learning event on unconscious group dynamics. And for me, that was an eye-opener, because for the first time, what I see is that on the surface, people can be all very professional and polite to each other. But is politeness actually reflecting real respect and trust and cohesion, or is politeness more actually a sign of lacking of trust and real cohesiveness.
Yeah.
And that was for me quite profound, and also sometimes emotional learning, to realize that there are a lot that's underneath the surface. On the surface, it's all calm and all working well together. But then, if you have the space to actually talk about the assumptions that's in people's head, and also the histories that people interpret in their heads. So what they think when you ask people, okay, what do you think about the other functions, and then they start telling you stories in the past. That they have about that function, and the same story can be interpreted in an entirely different way.
Yep.
When a different department is looking at the same incident. It just makes it very clear to me that there's that there's this pattern, that's this real thing that is going on, and I have to get to those real things by pointing out the illusions in the surface. Because if you ask a team, oh, do you trust each other? If you ask them in front of everyone, most people will tell you that they trust each other.
Absolutely.
We're a good team, we are fine. But if you ask them, okay, then tell me about the stories that you have about each other, a significant event that actually shows or defines your team. You get a different sense, and of course asking why and why and why, going deeper and deeper. That's as a psychologist, for me, that's a fascinating but also very effective way of finding out what's really in there. Yeah.
Okay, and how do you show that to the people that you're working with? Because one of the things that I've experienced is that it's quite challenging to get this kind of idea across to other people. Once you see it, and once you look at the world through that lens, everything begins to take on patterns. But getting the information across to other people, so how do you take the information that you're learning from them and then demonstrate it to them so that they can interpret it themselves?
Yeah, so that's where organizational network analysis can come in very handy. So usually I start with teams, because I think for teams they have less resistance in terms of getting, I think, tougher feedback. I think for them it's a tough feedback, a tough reality check sometimes to look at organizational network analysis, where they see, okay, if within our teams, who is closer with who might be the one or two members who got isolated, and who might be the one or two key connectors that is sustaining the system, and even to think about, okay, what if these one or two members are gone? What if they leave the company or they rotate to some other systems, and then who else can we then rely on to maintain and connect everyone into a cohesive piece? And how information flows. So there are different types of questions we ask with network analysis. So sometimes it's more on information flow. So you see, who are the hubs of information. But a lot of times we also ask about trust and closeness. So who do you feel closer with? Who do you talk to more often? Who would you talk to if you have a very challenging, difficult personal situation? Something that's indicating the connections beneath the work connections. And for me, that's really where true collaboration comes in. What I also want to help clients to do is to do both network analysis and also having some sort of experiential learning or some profound conversations to discuss about the insights that they get from those analyses, rather than always just I give them the insight. Because for me, it's a process to engage both the mind and the heart. To then notice what are the patterns and then build the motivation to change the pattern. And I hope that by doing both, the mind and the heart can, help organizations also build a confidence that things can change. And that's something I think is quite important as well, because sometimes you can show them analysis, they say, oh, this is the way things are. Yeah, we have silos. We have always been like this for the past 20 years. But that doesn't have to be the case, right? You can have a platform. So I will also facilitate platform to help people then discuss about why this pattern has been like this the whole time. What are the impact it's creating on people, and there usually are both positive and negative impact the current system has, and have to facilitate a conversation so that they can then realize how they can empower themselves to break the pattern.
Yeah. So do you, how do you represent the results to these teams? Do you do it visually? Do you produce reports?
Oh, yeah.
How do you do that?
Yeah, so I found visual presentation really powerful. You basically have like groups, a cluster here and a cluster there, and then they're just isolated. Those things are very powerful. And sometimes people do underestimate the role of like the little guys. I always say there are little guys in the organization who maybe is the tea lady, who connects everyone.
Yeah.
And to be able to visually see that, it's almost like putting up a mirror, in front of teams, and then they suddenly see, oh, okay, so that's how we are.
And how do you collect the data?
Yeah, so it depends on each situation, the project needs, the client's needs are quite different every time. So sometimes it's particularly with a team. It could be an existing team who has been working for quite some time, or it could also sometimes be a new team where they want to see what's the starting point of their current patterns. And with teams, then I will usually then this will be a short questionnaire, and then it's really short, 5 questions at most, and have people share, for example, like who do you feel closer with, and who do you talk to more often, or even sometimes to rank them or to rate. And then with that data, we can generate a network graph for the company. Yeah. And then on another thing I sometimes do, also particularly with clients who are still in the transition to taking a more systemic view, is that I would run some simulations and workshops, like workshops that touch on group dynamics. So you have people doing group activities, and then in those workshops, I would pause and ask everyone to type in their level of connections with different groups, and then just immediately then show the graph to them, and then they may realize, oh, okay, as it turns out, a typical scenario would be, okay, people with similar background tends to talk more with people with similar backgrounds. So and then it might end up to become like 3 different subgroups, because there are 3 different subgroups with more commonality within each group. And then there's also very helpful information for them to realize how, without being conscious of it, they were actually excluding people.
Yeah.
So there's a big learning also on inclusion and diversity with this kind of exercise, and to just, I think it's very important to help people to realize that even with the best intent, even with the most positive intent, you could still end up with having patterns that are not effective.
Yeah.
So it's important to not to judge and say, oh, okay, you guys are bad, and that's why you have this ineffective system, you are isolating people. It's not that. It's more that, okay, that's just the way it is, and patterns emerge, and it's now, as long as you can look at it and you accept that's how things are, you can then change it. Yeah. So for me, that's important. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk a wee bit about those changes that you then enable people to sort of bring about in the workplace. So if we go back to the comment you made about your 4-day week, I'm assuming, and maybe I'm wrong here, but I'm assuming that in your workplace you use these patterns and you're aware of them, and that's been part of the process of moving towards a 4-day week. Is that correct?
With 4-day week, so we didn't use the network analysis to apply that in our own office. I mean, we have only 10 people in Hong Kong, so for us it's more the discussion. But then also another important thing is everyone in the office are to some extent exposed to network analysis and also group dynamics. So I think the awareness towards patterns and the ability to discuss patterns may be easier.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but then what we are doing internally is to apply network analysis to see how our international community may be able to collaborate even better. And that's an ongoing project we have recently started. Okay. And it's interesting because Atrain is experimenting a lot with different ways of operation. So, for example, in our headquarters in German office, they're going really agile and having self-organizing teams.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, we're changing our global structure as well. And then we have new offices coming up. So it's a very dynamic system.
Yeah.
And I think this is a dynamic system is also really, perfect fit for applying network analysis.
Yeah.
Because then it will help us to see, okay, who is impacting on who and what are the changes. And I have to say, this research, even though we've just actually started it for quite a few weeks, in the process of gathering data, it's already getting a lot of interest and attention from internally.
Yeah.
There are high hopes in making sure that this will work and that this will help us internally as well.
Okay. Okay. So, yeah, I'm wondering if you can identify where this kind of pattern analysis and network analysis is particularly useful. You talked about how in your team there's only 10 people. So, my experience is that the more complex the organization and the more obvious the need to identify these patterns becomes. So complexity obviously grows with the number of people in a company. So do you have examples of where you found pattern analysis being particularly useful?
Yeah. So right now, I think mostly I'm still working with teams to help, because I think the thing is, I feel that Atrain, because we were in this sort of work, and so internally we talk about the dynamics. But then I think in many organizations, that's not the case. And to even trigger organizations to start talking about patterns, team patterns and team dynamics, that takes a nudge. And for me, that nudge is with organizational network analysis, because it's very helpful to see, okay, there really are differences in terms of how people connect. And I think accepting that differences is sometimes more difficult than I had imagined, because I think many teams want to convince themselves that we are all equals, everyone has an equal weight in all decisions, there's no politics, and I saw you smiling with that. And I think it's sometimes for me, ONA is just really something to point out that actually there are all these things going on. If you pretend that they're not here, it's going to continue to have an impact. It's just that the impact will not be something you can foresee. Yeah.
So, what kind of size are these teams, and what sort of organizations are they within?
Yeah. So usually they are leadership teams. So right now, I do quite a bit with leadership teams of size that's around within 20 people. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And with larger scale organization, what I've done so far is more blending the network analysis into an experiential learning session. So if sometimes the experiential learning session can be from 60 people to hundreds, mm-hmm. and then with that, we can then plot graphs. And I think I feel that it's also a transition phase, because mm-hmm. what I'm seeing is that after organizations have had some experience with in a safe sort of workshop game kind of session where they try this, they start to understand that, okay, maybe I can try and do this with a bigger team. Mm-hmm. Maybe I can compare patterns across team. But I think it's still an initial interest that we are seeing in that regard.
Okay, so am I right in thinking then, when you talked about 60 to 100, you do network analysis with that many people in a workshop scenario, and then you're able to draw the networks there in front of them? Yeah. And how long does that take?
Well, we try and simplify, because it's a simulation, so it's a game, which means in a way it's a slightly more simplified. So we're not actually asking them to break the connections with each individual as in like in a work context. It's more, okay, how is your connection with another team, for instance? And then because it's simplified, then it's much easier. So and the thing is, we don't interpret for them if it's a real-time graph generation. So we just generate a graph. show it, and then have them discuss what are the patterns that they are seeing.
Okay.
And I think the learning really comes from themselves interpreting rather than from me interpreting in those sessions. Yeah.
Okay, and have you got any examples of seeing significant change and benefit as a result of the work that you've done?
Yeah, absolutely. So one example would be in this simulation where there are a group of freelancers. They're freelancers. They're not really freelancers, okay? They are just playing the role of freelancers in the system. And then there are a group of customers, and then there are a group of people who are in an organization. And then, of course, I mean, the resources will be coming from customers, so people try to engage with the customers and satisfy their needs. And then the graph they saw was, shit, the freelancers are very close with the customers, but the whole organization are absorbed into resolving their own conflict and their own tension. No one is actually in this organization looking at their customers. And then, of course, then they realize, no, we need to restructure ourselves. We need to have key account management systems so that we have someone who is always be connected with the customer. We need to think about how we engage with the freelancers, because the freelancers are already very close with the customers. Then they know something that we don't know. What if we make them partners? What if we even hire them and so that they no longer become freelancers? They're part of us. And the very intriguing and powerful thing I saw was that, yes, it's a game. Yes, they change the structure and they learn all these in a game. But really, is it only in a game?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, and in the discussions, they realize all these patterns of being self-absorbed into power structure and power and conflict, ambiguity in information, people holding information and not sharing because that's a way of maintaining power. And even also sometimes even with good intent, you think, oh, maybe I shouldn't share too much because that may overburden someone, but then that ends up actually having huge issues. Or how you think that you want to have more people to, or sometimes you want to be inclusive, you involve a lot of people, but then that also sometimes in the end up meaning no one is actually taking the ball. Too many people trying to do the same thing doesn't help. All these patterns, they are exactly the same as in the workplace.
Yeah.
So to help, and so right now I do have some clients who are thinking, okay, so we've learned this in a game setting, and we kind of are aware that these might be similar patterns at work. What can we do to change?
Okay.
And I'm very happy to see that some clients, they are already discussing, okay, what are the things to continue to do, to change, to add or to stop in order to change these patterns internally. So that follow-up discussions becomes very critical. Yeah.
Okay, and you mentioned to me before that you've been interested in this for a number of years, and it's been quite difficult to get people to listen to this, but you're beginning to see a shift in that process.
Yeah. And I think in a way, it's the shift comes from, I think there are many factors. One is probably people are frustrated enough with doing lots of individual training and doesn't have any return on investment. Yep. I think that's a big thing. So people start to see, okay, I have to look more than individuals. Yeah. And then another thing is, okay, so once people start looking beyond individuals, then what's next? And then what happened is that many organizations start introducing new processes and systems without looking at the current patterns. So what they do is, okay, now let's all be self-organizing, or let's now all have this different kind of reporting line, or we have all these cross-functional project teams. But then they also see that, okay, some of these structures succeeded, but some failed. Why? I mean, what's really making the difference? It's not the structure or the system itself is making a difference. It's something else that's making either this process work or doesn't work. So they look a bit deeper and they say, oh, okay, in the end, it's a lot to do with the interpersonal interactions. It's the connections between the individuals, among individuals, and among groups that is really making the difference. And that's where there's now more interest in this. And I think from my side, to try and immediately say, okay, now what about doing an organizational network analysis for your whole organization? Sometimes for some organizations that seem too big of a leap, because maybe just 6 months ago they were still focusing a lot on individuals' development, and not only this, and that's why I think the blend of experiential learning and the linking some learnings about system, some learning about group dynamics, but then doing those organizational network analysis in a smaller scale, either within a team or in a game simulated setting, helps to stimulate those conversations and switch that mindset into thinking more about, oh, okay, maybe there's other ways. So in addition to it, individual development is still helpful, but in addition to that, what might be some other things that can produce bigger impact? What might be leverage points? Yeah.
So when you get involved with an organization, they don't come to you initially because you are particularly interested in organizational network analysis or pattern. It's more about training and leadership. That's how you make the introduction.
Sometimes it's training leadership, sometimes it's cultural change. Sometimes it's like organizational transformation.
Okay.
A lot around agile transformation. But you see, honestly, I think organizational network analysis is a tool, and I think it's a very powerful tool that can help to address a lot of the things relating to leadership, efficiency, transformation, everything people talk about facing a VUCA world. I do think ONA has a lot to yet to be contribute in achieving all these.
Yeah. Do you think that part of the reason why it's becoming a wee bit more, gaining a bit of traction, a bit of interest, is the fact that the world is going through, significant transformation? I mean, the digital world and networks are part of the world around about us. And we've got all access to all this amazing technology, which is increasing our capacity as individuals, becoming superhuman, having access to amazing amounts of knowledge and information, and also the ability for data analysis. Do you think that is the industry 4.0? Do you think this is part of the process of change, people becoming more interested in this?
Yeah, I absolutely think it is, and the urge from the external environment to ask you to change and adapt does make people think, okay, how do I adapt? And I think that's taps into the understanding of what are the current patterns, and I think there's another big piece is there's this human factor in whatever digital transformation people are trying to drive. No matter if any globalization activities or digitization, human factor is a big factor, if not the only factor in a way, in my view. Is at the core of everything. And I can give you an example that shows how I think sometimes the missing of looking at interaction patterns can really derail a digital transformation initiative. So there's this organization I know of where they're really into being more digital. So they even have this funding they give for or any project teams who can come up with digital ideas. They give money to them to create a new app or whatever new process they want to do that is more digital. So as long as it's digital, you get money. Essentially, that's how it is. And what happened next is people starting to create products and projects that satisfy the needs of the digital person who would give the money out, rather than satisfying the needs of the people who actually have to use those things in the end. So you start seeing 10, 20 new apps that no one uses. And they're all expensive because they're all funded centrally, and then they need to find coders to create all these things. And it's very sad, in my view, because everyone has good intent, okay? And I have to say, it's a courageous move for the organization as well. And honestly, the project teams who were trying to create the apps, they're not thinking from the angle of just getting more money. I mean, for them, they can do less work if they actually don't do anything, right? So for them, they were really trying to create something new to help the organization transform. But it's just that if you don't realize the pattern of communication was basically just project team and the money, the budget approver, and never really, or not never, but at least not much with end user. And end user actually doesn't have much say and influence over whether or not the project got approved it. You end up having projects and products that meets the needs of, meets the imagined needs of the budget holder. But not the needs of the end user. And that's just a classic example for me to see how in the rush towards digital transformation, sometimes we forgot about the human interaction patterns, and that can completely change whether or not you can have a successful digital transformation.
Absolutely. It's the whole process of system thinking, in a way that if you look at it just as a task, then you forget that that task is being carried out within a system, and that system is all about people. And you use system thinking a lot in your work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think ONA it's one of the key tools to help visualize systems. And I think right now, honestly, I don't even know where are there like other ways to help visualize systems, and it's such an important thing. I think actually all organizations need to sooner or later have ONA as part of something on their annual report. I actually think it's just like how many organizations are doing engagement survey now. I think that's not enough. Network graphs needs to be in their annual reports.
That's really important, Grace. Can you say a wee bit more about why you don't think engagement surveys are enough? I mean, I get it, totally get it, but I think sometimes it's this bit about it can be lost in translation if you don't see that outcomes come from this collective pattern. Engagement sounds like it's collective. So why don't you think it's enough?
Well, I think with engagement surveys, the thing is, the question is, does engagement survey actually tells you how engaged people are? I've seen organizations where they say, oh, you know, my boss expect me to not put a too low a score there, otherwise we will need to do follow-up work. Or sometimes it's depending on the mood of the individual on that particular day. So to this day, maybe they had a team dinner and they were very happy, and then they say, I'm very engaged. It's, the good thing is that I know there are now more sort of pulse check kind of engagement survey, which may actually tell you more about, the reality of engagement, because it's on day-to-day basis rather than once a year. But then I think even with that, it's helpful information, but I think it doesn't give you a lot of pointers as to how you then intervene later. Because, for example, so sometimes what happens, let's say if actually this is a real case. So you may have one function that is really disengaged, and then you have another function that's highly engaged. The traditional approach is then you hire some consultants or internal people to fix the group that is very disengaged. You talk to them and you ask, oh, why are you disengaged? As if they are causing themselves to be disengaged. You know what I mean? And then of course they start telling you all these stories that are not just about themselves, but also about their interactions with other teams. And then you say, oh, but then what you then realize is, okay, this unhappy team is telling you that they're unhappy because of their interactions with the happy teams. And then you doesn't, but then I'm not. Like the organization doesn't expect me to talk to the happy teams because they think they're not broken, so you don't need to fix them. You don't need to do any intervention. They have high engagement score. And then take a step back and say, wait a second. that doesn't seem right, because it could be that the unhappy team may be just carrying a lot of stress and pressure in the system, so that other teams can be happy. It could be around distribution of resources, or even just different perception about how things should be done. Maybe they feel unfairly treated in some ways, and they were never, they never had a discussion about how each groups were treated in different ways. Or maybe is it really different? That's even an assumption, could be, right?
Yeah.
So that's why I think if you have a network analysis, or maybe even if engagement research is done in a way that also looks at network patterns, I think that may actually help organizations to address issues more effectively than with the traditional way of doing it.
Yeah, that's a really good explanation, that the whole point that somebody might be disengaged is their fault, and in reality it's the system that is one of the outcomes of the patterns within the system. And if you can look at the whole system, then it becomes kind of obvious that you can't fix it by trying to fix that one element.
Yeah.
It made me think of something. I wonder if you how you see this. At the beginning you talked about how some people who would be termed a kind of a bit part player perhaps to the team, but in terms of relationships can be very, very important. So they might not be, one of the leaders, but they're still very important to that collective impact. Do you think there is a role for this kind of analysis in terms of promotion or benefits, or in some way?
Yeah, I do think so. I think it's acknowledging how these connectors are contributing to the system, and I think that's. I don't know in what way should it be linked to promotion, or even giving them a role. Because giving them a role is also another thing, right? Then there's almost like, okay, now the responsibility of connecting and communicating lies only on those people. In a way, I think it's give an excuse for others to not do the connecting, which is also not something we want to encourage. But I think at least acknowledging that there are these people who are playing the connector roles, they may not be the traditional star performers. They may not be the one who gets the most sales, who presents with the most, charming, charismatic way. But then they are contributing. They are contributing a lot, in fact. And I do think this is important. I mean, sometimes I think to recognize connection as a contribution brings the human side back to business, I think, in a way.
That's really, really important part for me, because I suppose I was sort of beginning to get to the point of asking you where you think this will go in terms of, what would you like to see in terms of the future and how this is used. But you've said something that's really important to me, because I think there's a growing impact on the workplace of technology, which is kind of reductionist in a way. It's removing that humanity, whereas the whole idea of collaboration and connections as a group thing begins to, because it's generally these relationships are informal. You can't formalize really these relationships. It's human interaction. So this idea of bringing more humanity into the workplace, is that something that you're getting positive response from businesses? Do they recognize this as being important?
Well, absolutely. I think, and I think there are two layers to that. So if you ask, okay, bringing the human side back to the business, would you agree? If you ask anyone, of course they will agree. I mean, think about if someone says they don't agree to that. I mean, you'd be like, you monster. So that's, I think cognitively, everyone agrees. I think it's sometimes the how and also the assumption about human nature that might be the difference. I think sometimes, the reductionist approach is it's a paradigm in itself, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something about individually I can be better. So even if I do a network analysis, there can be a conclusion that, okay, you see this group is isolating themselves. You see this person is not engaging with others. Now you have a one-star performer who is connecting very well with others. You can also interpret it in that way, right? You just almost use the network graph and just start highlighting the individuals in it, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
But I think there is a different paradigm, which is which really is about taking things from a systemic perspective, where you realize that actually the individual who got isolated, yes, maybe could be an introvert, I don't know, but there's also a big piece on how the rest of the system is not making it easy for this person to become part of the main system. I think, that actually reminds me of saying. So in the past, there was some saying about women leaders needing to lean in more.
Mm-hmm.
And then more recently, I heard of this other line of thought saying that, well, maybe we have been giving too much positive bias towards those who lean in a lot. So it's not about people needing to speak louder, but actually maybe everyone can listen a bit more and to sift through what you see and actually notice the shining bits and not the ones that's always in the forefront spamming you with information. And for me, it's a shift in seeing, in the way to see things. It's in like individuals need to do this more versus, okay, let's look at the system. Yes, individuals are important. Everyone has the power to shape the system, but it's not just the individuals. It's the linkage, it's the interactions, and the ripple effect that's causing the ultimate impact, and it's not an easy, A to B sort of causal relationship. And for me, that's the human side I'm talking about. Maybe it's not just the human side. I think it's more even the social side of interactions, of business, of humanity.
I completely convinced that you're right about that we haven't understood that different ways of working have different impacts. So this bit about how women behave in the workplace is, we maybe don't have enough data yet to demonstrate this, but it's really, really important that we don't just say this is how a star individual works, so that's how a star female leader should work. It has to be more about the impact on the wider system, or else we don't understand it, and that's the thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to highlight that I don't undermine the importance of individual behaviors, because to change a system, you need individuals to self-authorize, almost self-empower, to change and challenge the status quo. I think it's just more sort of almost stop blaming the victim kind of mindset.
I mean, there's always individuals. Everybody is an individual, and that's important. And we want to. In fact, I think by better understanding the system, I mean, my perception here is by better understanding the system, we give people more space to be individuals. And if we learn how that can be beneficial and everybody can find their space within a system, and that understanding of where they fit within the system, then it provides the opportunity for us to do more with less, which leads us back to the potential that we can have a 4-day week. But I'm not really somebody who believes in, okay, let's have a 4-day week and we'll just do everything that we did before in 4 days. I think there needs to be a shift towards understanding how to empower the collective so that you can do more with less. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot, and I think the interesting thing so we've been testing 4-day week for 11 months now, and what I notice is it's about taking away the things that has been wasting time. It's not so much about adding new kind of ways to work. But of course, there's a prerequisite. I think the prerequisite is that people do have a common purpose. There's trust. and there's already collaboration to start with.
Yeah.
Because what happens is if you you shorten your work week, and then people will find ways to make things work if they have a common purpose and if they are willing to collaborate. You don't need to wait for a boss or someone to be physically present to force you to do something. And that's the difference I would say between real collaboration versus illusion of collaboration. And I think that's the way to try and make work more efficient for me is to point out the illusion that has been there before.
Okay, well, thanks very much for your, the journey through your discovery of network analysis and patterns and how they impact on the workplace. Just to sort of bring this to a close, where would you like to see this work? Maybe in your own workplace, but in a wider sense, say within the next 5 to 10 years. What do you imagine that it could become?
What I hope is to see people in organizations start asking questions about the system they are in. And a behavioral sign could be that they start doing network analysis, or at least they start drawing system maps.
Yeah.
If they think that, okay, I have one decision to make, I need to think about the impact. You start drawing the system map. You start involving others in creating that system map to help you see, how things might fit, and who else do you need to talk to before you, make an investment or make certain decisions, and to also reflect on. So if I see people reflecting on how they are contributing to certain system patterns, and how they are experiencing certain system patterns. Maybe they felt that they have been locked into a certain pattern, or maybe they felt that they could do more, but then somehow now they are not enabled. But then if they could articulate it in a systemic way, rather than in the form of just whining and complaining, that could be a big difference. That also helps to, I think, reinforce mutual understanding. Because I think the difference would be, so if I just say, I want a promotion, I say I want a promotion, it could just be a frustrated complaint when I don't get it. But if I actually see how the system plays out, and then I see, okay, now I understand my manager's perspective. So what are the factors that it's making my manager having certain pressure or certain constraints, or preferences, and how about other players? They're HR players, right? They are my managers as a player, maybe my customer as a player. So if you look at all the dynamics, and then revisit your own wants and needs, I think there's higher chance to then for people to see, okay, what are the missing pieces that I have not thought of before? What are the leverage points I can tap? And I think that awareness, for me, would be very powerful.